The wind rolled over the rye fields like a restless animal, flattening one patch, lifting another, and carrying the sharp smell of distant smoke. In the middle of that trembling landscape stood a boy no older than 15, his boots half sunk in the damp earth of occupied Poland in late autumn of 1943. His hands clutched the wooden crossbeam of a crude kite, bright patches sewn from old flour sacks, and in front of him loomed the impossible sight of a German reconnaissance plane sweeping low enough to rattle the grass. The Henschel Hs-126's engine growled with the cold arrogance of a predator circling a wounded animal. Any sane child would have run, ducked, or thrown a stone out of desperation. But this one tilted his wrist, feeling the twitch of the kite line like a living nerve. What kind of boy stands against a machine built to hunt resistance fighters, to mark villages for artillery, to signal Luftwaffe squadrons that would pulverize barns, fields, and families? What kind of mind looks at a steel-winged scout aircraft and thinks of a toy? He wasn't fearless. His breath stuttered, his shoulders shook, and the cold tore at his eyes. Yet he held his ground because his village had only hours before hidden a group of wounded partisans, and he knew what happened when a recon plane spotted tracks, smoke, or movement. Stories spread fast in occupied territories, stories of villages shelled into chalk dust because one observer aircraft survived long enough to radio coordinates back to the batteries waiting just beyond the horizon. The plane drifted closer, its undercarriage almost grazing the treetops, the pilot perhaps amused by the lone, stubborn child refusing to scatter. The boy raised the kite higher, as if offering a challenge. For a heartbeat, nothing seemed remarkable. Just a child playing in a war zone, a moment too absurd to make sense. But the real absurdity was still hidden, the thin wire running from the kite's tail, glinting faintly, nearly invisible against the burning white sky. No one watching from the windows dared to shout. The village held its breath. The fields held their silence. A single reckless idea stood between survival and annihilation. A patchwork kite climbing into the path of a machine that could erase every life within a mile. Across the occupied territories during 1943 to 44, from the plains of Poland to the farmlands of Belarus and the fractured countryside of northern France, there existed a single terror that civilians learned to recognize long before they ever saw a tank column or marching battalion: the silhouette of a reconnaissance aircraft. To outsiders, the Henschel Hs-126 seemed unimposing. Its thin fuselage, spindly landing gear, and long transparent canopy looked flimsy compared to the brutal shapes of dive bombers and fighters. But to villagers, partisans, and anyone living beneath the reach of German artillery, it was the most lethal herald imaginable. The moment its observer leaned over the map table and lifted a radio handset, lives could end within minutes. Record logs uncovered after the war reveal how efficiently these scout planes synchronized destruction. A single pass over a suspicious settlement, a plume of chimney smoke in a forbidden zone, or footprints in fresh snow was enough for the observer to call coordinates back to the nearest Nebelwerfer or 105mm howitzer batteries. Thousands of shells could be on their way before the aircraft even turned for a second look. That was why people hid livestock under trees, painted roofs with mud, smothered cooking fires with wet rags, and sent children to act as early warning sentinels along ridge lines. To allow one recon aircraft to escape unharmed was to invite ruin upon everyone who had ever shared bread across the same table. In the boys' village, the threat had grown acute. Partisan movements had become active in the forests beyond the river, sabotaging rail lines used by German supply trains pushing toward the Eastern Front. Whenever saboteurs struck, the Hs-126s returned the next morning, sweeping low, mapping trails, and calling in bombardments that cracked earth and splintered farmhouses. People began marking time not by church bells or harvest cycles, but by the drone of reconnaissance engines passing overhead. And now, one of those aircraft drifted directly above the fields, its shadow sliding across roofs like a blade. This was not a routine pass. The pilot was circling, hunting, pausing in a slow turn that meant suspicion. Maybe a survivor's footprint, maybe smoke from a hidden camp, maybe a rumor whispered by an informer. Every villager understood the pattern. Circle, fix, transmit, obliterate. That was why no one laughed at the absurd idea of resisting it. That was why the boy's kite, ridiculous as it appeared, mattered more than anyone dared say aloud. The boy's kite trembled in the rising wind, but the line he held was no ordinary string. Hidden beneath the frayed twine was a tightly twisted strand of thin metal, scrap wire salvaged from a broken radio coil the villagers had dismantled months earlier to avoid detection. It was a secret passed through whispers, not orders, because no occupying force ever imagined that peasants could turn children's toys into traps. Yet resistance groups across Europe and Asia had already discovered the brutal simplicity of it. When a light reconnaissance aircraft flew low enough, even a hair-thin wire could become a weapon capable of severing a propeller blade or dragging a spinning engine into catastrophic imbalance. The origins of the trick stretched far beyond this field. In the forests of eastern Poland, partisans had stretched steel piano wire between trees to slice the wings of low-flying spotter planes. In rural China, local militias strung copper lines between rooftops to snare Japanese Ki-36 scouts. Soviet defenders in the early years of Operation Barbarossa used cable from ruined power poles hoisted by balloons or kites to tear through German propellers. These tactics were rarely documented, partly because they were improvised acts of desperation, and partly because no army wished to admit that a million-mark aircraft could be defeated by household scraps. The boy didn't invent anything. He had simply listened, really listened, when the older men, exhausted from hiding in the woods, shared half-forgotten stories around the bread ovens late at night. They spoke of trickery, not heroism, of survival, not glory. Someone joked once that a kite might be enough to bring one down, and the adults laughed, shaking their heads, but the boy had not laughed. He had memorized every word. And when the Recon plane returned today, flying lower than usual, circling with the distinct predatory patience of a hunter that smelled wounded prey, he remembered the stories. He remembered the wire coiled behind the workshop. He remembered how little time the villagers had before artillery followed. So he knotted the wire to the spine of his patched cloth kite, ignoring the mutters and chuckles of neighbors who thought he was acting out childish fantasies. No one believed such a ridiculous contraption could matter. But children in wartime often see possibilities adults overlook, not because they are brave, but because they are desperate enough to try the things grown men are too embarrassed to attempt. What hung in the air now was not a toy, but a silent question. Would a crude piece of metal, lifted by nothing more than wind and a boy's stubborn grip, be enough to alter the fate of an entire village? A low rumble rolled across the fields as the Henschel Hs-126 banked sharply, its wings cutting a long arc over the village roofs. Dust spiraled upward from the road as the plane descended for a closer inspection. Too slow, too deliberate. The kind of pass that meant the observer had seen something worth killing over. The boy felt the tremor of the earth beneath his boots, but the real tremor came from the tautness in the line he gripped. The kite jerked violently as a sudden gust surged from the west, the kind of wind that arrives without warning, lifting the patched cloth higher than he'd ever seen it fly. Villagers watching through cracks in shutters could hardly breathe. They saw the absurd thing rising, fluttering, wobbling, then stabilizing as the wind seized it with uncanny precision. The wire hidden inside the line stretched upward, glinting faintly as it met the sunlight. For a brief moment, it looked like a shimmer of air, a trick of the eye, something too fragile to matter. But fate often hides inside fragile things. The aircraft dipped lower still, engine throttling back as the observer leaned forward to scan the fields. They weren't looking at the sky. They were looking at the ground, at footprints, tracks, disturbances in the soil. That blindness brought the plane directly into the climbing path of the Kite. The boy saw it before anyone else. The line lifting, stretching, angling perfectly into the space where propeller and wind carved their circle of force. Then came the sound. Not an explosion, not the scream of metal tearing itself apart, but a single, sharp, crystalline ting. So small, it could have been mistaken for a pebble striking a window pane. Yet that sound carried through the field like a verdict. The wire snapped tight, drawn into the spinning blades. A flash of sparks burst along the propeller arc. The plane jolted, shuddered, and its engine coughed with the painful stutter of mechanical ruin. Inside the cockpit, the pilot yanked the controls, trying to understand the sudden drag pulling the nose downward. The observer grabbed the side rails as maps scattered. The aircraft wobbled, losing its clean, predatory precision and dropping into a clumsy, uneven glide. On the ground, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if listening to what would follow after that impossible, delicate strike. The boy's heart hammered, not with triumph, but with disbelief, because he realized he had just stepped past the boundary separating childish imagination from deadly consequence. A village's fate now hung on the sputtering rhythm of a dying engine. Inside the cockpit, panic arrived as confusion rather than fear. The pilot felt the vibration first, a violent shudder running from the propeller hub through the control column into his wrists. Training told him this kind of tremor usually followed a hit from ground fire, maybe a burst from a hidden partisan machine gun, maybe a ricochet from shrapnel thrown upward by a poorly aimed mortar. He scanned the tree line, expecting muzzle flashes. None appeared. The observer cursed, convinced they had flown into a fragment of anti-aircraft debris left drifting after some unseen skirmish. But the truth was stranger than any assumption racing through their minds. The wire tightened again, then snapped, coiling around the propeller hub in a spiraling embrace that the crew mistook for catastrophic engine failure. Oil sprayed in thin streaks along the lower fuselage. The aircraft yawed left, then right, losing symmetry. Below that chaotic descent, the boy, still gripping the frayed remains of the line, watched as the Kite plummeted toward the ground, its purpose fulfilled. To the villagers, it looked as though the child's toy had simply died in the wind, but the boy knew better. He knew that the stupid trick everyone mocked had found its mark. What would you have thought, watching from a window? Would you have believed a child's hand could alter the outcome of a war-scarred morning? The aircraft staggered into a shallow dive, its engine coughing like a wounded animal. The pilot fought the controls, but the balance was gone. A Recon plane like the HS-126 was light and nimble, built for visibility, not durability. Once its propeller blade warped even a few degrees, aerodynamic symmetry collapsed. Reports from Eastern Front diaries confirm how easily such aircraft were forced into emergency landings, sometimes with nothing more than a sliver of wire caught in the wrong place. The observer reached for the radio, trying to transmit something, anything, but static drowned every syllable. The aircraft's shaking made it impossible to keep the antenna aligned. He didn't know it, but the moment the propeller struck the wire, The boy had already prevented the most dangerous part of their mission, calling down destruction on the village. Below, people peeked from hiding places, torn between awe and terror. No adult wanted to admit that a child had done what entire units failed to accomplish. And yet the evidence roared above them, a spiraling machine, slowly losing its war-born authority. Could this really be happening? Someone whispered behind a barn wall. But no one dared say it loudly. The failing Hs-126 limped across the sky like a wounded bird, its once smooth flight devolving into jerks and lurches that scraped the air with uneven rhythm. The engine screeched each time the damaged propeller completed a rotation, the impact sending metallic pulses through the valley. In the prison of the cockpit, the pilot recognized the truth no aviator wanted to face. Altitude was slipping too fast, the controls were losing authority, and the machine was no longer something he commanded, but something he was desperately trying to negotiate with. A Recon aircraft could survive a clogged fuel line or a jammed aileron, but a warped propeller was fatal. Every second of imbalance pulled the nose down further. Below, the village remained frozen, doors half open, animals silent, mothers holding children motionless in the dark. The boy stood in the field, trembling not from cold, but from the enormity of what he had done. His hands still stung from the snap of the wire. The broken kite lay in the grass like a discarded relic, its purpose spent. No cheers rose. No one raced to congratulate him. War had trained people to fear consequences more than celebrate miracles. As the aircraft descended, the guards stationed on the outskirts, men assigned by the occupation authorities to monitor movement, could see the plane's erratic path. They should have reported it. They should have signaled. They should have raised alarms that would unleash patrols and investigators. But something very human intervened, something never written in military handbooks. They watched the crippled plane sputter, twist, and falter, and they turned their eyes away. Some later claimed they thought it was a mechanical failure. Others insisted the fog had distorted their view, and a few quietly admitted, years after the war, that they simply did not want to be part of whatever retribution would follow a crashed scout plane. A recon craft going down meant headquarters would demand explanations, names, and punishment. If they pretended not to see, then no single villager or child could be singled out. Their silence was not mercy. It was self-preservation wrapped in a thin layer of accidental compassion. The aircraft dropped lower still, brushing the tops of willow trees near the riverbank. Smoke leaked from the cowling in thin gray threads. The pilot's gloved hands shook as he fought gravity, and the observer pressed his back against the seat, bracing for impact that could come anywhere: field, barn, or forest clearing. Watching from their windows, villagers felt a strange conflict. Fear for their lives mixed with the sting of sympathy for the men inside the machine meant to destroy them. If you were there, watching that hobbled aircraft stagger across the sky, would you have prayed for its crash, or prayed for the lives inside it? The Recon plane's glide finally surrendered to gravity as it dipped toward a muddy pasture beyond the village boundary. The pilot fought to level the wings, pulling every last ounce of stability from a machine that no longer obeyed. The damaged propeller carved stuttering circles through the air, trailing a faint spiral of smoke behind it. Then the landing gear struck the ground, once hard enough to jar teeth loose, twice bouncing wildly, and finally collapsing into the earth with a grinding collapse that sent the aircraft skidding sideways across the field. Clods of wet soil rained upward. The left wing snapped against the fence post, scattering splintered wood across the grass. When the wreck slid to a stop, everything fell eerily still. The boy did not run toward the crash site, though adrenaline urged him forward. Instead, he backed away slowly, hiding the frayed end of the wire in his sleeve. Villagers gathered at a distance, unsure whether to approach. Some feared the aircraft might explode. Others feared soldiers would soon arrive and accuse them of sabotage. No one pointed at the child. No one asked questions. Their silence formed a fragile shield around him. Hours later, German patrols reached the scene. The pilot and observer had survived, bruised and shaken, but alive, and their confusion only deepened during interrogation. They swore they'd been hit by ground fire or perhaps struck by falling debris from another engagement. They described a sudden impact, a jolt, the engine juddering out of rhythm. But what they could not explain, what no engineering officer could replicate, was how such a clean, precise failure occurred without a single bullet hole in the fuselage. The village was questioned, though half-heartedly. No one knew of any firearms. No one had seen muzzle flashes. And certainly no one mentioned a kite. Then the strange part. The patrols left. No reprisals, no arrests, no burned homes. An entire community exhaled for the first time in days. The boy wandered home through alleys still heavy with tension, aware that his act had saved them, but equally aware that his name would never be spoken in any report. Nothing he had done would be recorded in official documents, wartime communiques, or post-war memoirs. Like countless unnamed civilians across Europe and Asia, children who guided refugees, sabotaged rail lines, hid messages in loaves of bread, or misled patrols with innocent faces, his victory lived only in whispers, a tale not of glory, but of fragile, improbable survival. A broken kite, a line of wire, and a village that woke the next morning still standing. Morning returned to the village with a pale light that carried no hint of the danger that had hovered above it the day before. Smoke rose quietly from kitchen chimneys. Chickens pecked along the roadside, and the fields, still scarred with the marks of the skidding aircraft, lay under a soft veil of frost. Nothing in the landscape revealed how close everything had come to ending. And yet, within the minds of those who had witnessed it, the memory of the boy and his patchwork kite would remain like a faint burn on the skin, subtle, but impossible to forget. History often chooses its heroes according to paperwork, rank, and medals, but war does not unfold only in the realm of official names. Sometimes it moves through small hands, through fragile objects, through moments of instinct rather than strategy. A child holding a line of wire is not the image one expects when speaking of resistance, yet that is how survival often looks. Quiet, improvised, and carried out by those who are too young to understand the full weight of their courage. In conflicts across Europe and Asia, anonymous civilians shaped outcomes in ways the world never learned to measure. Their stories slipped between the cracks of archives, lost in the noise of larger battles and louder victories. But every war has its shadows, and in those shadows live the truths that official histories rarely acknowledge. A grandmother hiding bread in her shawl for fugitives. A farmer turning his plow in a direction that misleads a patrol. A factory worker leaving a bolt intentionally loose. A child releasing a kite toward a spinning circle of steel. These acts form a quiet constellation of humanity scattered across vast darkness, tiny, nearly invisible lights that nonetheless push back against the void. Perhaps, decades later, someone walking through that same field might pause, sensing something unspoken in the air. Perhaps an elder, remembering the tremble of that wire, might close his eyes and still see the silhouette of a wobbling aircraft losing its certainty. And perhaps the boy, grown, forgotten, unrecognized, would still dream sometimes of the sharp ting that changed everything. A foolish toy, they said, but it saved an entire village from becoming ash on the wind. And the one who lifted it was just a boy, standing alone in a field, trusting the wind more than fear.